Ladies and gents, welcome back. As we've all known by now, the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, Paul Rouleau, Justice Rouleau, has declared it justified. And, well, on some absurd means, actually, in my opinion. And I've been quite upset about this one, and I haven't been a stranger to speaking my opinion publicly and on social media. But I wanted to get the opinion of an expert in law. So today we're going to be talking with Keith Wilson. Keith, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm upset. I mean, and I think the reason why I'm upset is we all kind of knew that they were going to try to justify it. And that's not the point that's really got me upset here. I feel like there's a breach of trust because they didn't just lie to us like we expected. We were expecting them to lie and say that it was justified, there was violence or what have you. They've conceded essentially that that's not the case. There's no proof of that being the case. But what Paul Rouleau suggested is that because of government incompetence, they were able to justify the use of suspending civil liberties in Canada. And I don't think that's far worse than just lying and then having it overruled by someone else to set a precedent where civil liberties can be suspended based on the government's incompetence. I feel like government incompetence should lead to them being suspended from their duties, not the other way around. Please get this out of my head and tell me where are we really?
Well, I mean, I think what the government's done, and I think what Mr. Rouleau's done, is he's overplayed his hand. And we saw that when I was on the ground with the truckers and the Freedom Convoy leaders. The government always overplayed their hand. They overplayed their hand at one point by saying no fuel for the truckers. And then the next day and the days after, we had the I am Spartacus moments with everybody bringing up jerry cans. And then we were anticipating, are they actually going to invoke the Emergencies Act? There's clearly no basis for it. You're not going to meet the legal test. And they invoked the Emergencies Act. And then they froze people's personal bank accounts and business bank accounts. So here, Clyde, when you and I have spoken before, I thought what Rouleau would do is sort of come up the middle and not rule definitively one way and say that, there's a bunch of evidence as to why people thought it shouldn't have been invoked and justified. And there's a bunch of evidences from government and others who thought why it should be, and then leave it at that. For him to go as far as he did, and so definitively say it was justified, even though his report in every section has evidence as to why it wasn't, and an abundance of evidence and the preponderance of evidence. So I think they overplayed their hand. And I think what it's doing is causing a very strong reaction. The first was shock on Friday and Saturday. People were very upset because we all had a little glimmer of hope. We didn't really think it was going to come out the way it should. But so that hope was taken away. There's a strong sense of loss and mourning. But now people are like, wait a minute. So that's the test, as you indicated, incompetence for stripping Canadians of their rights and giving government authoritarian full control over people's affairs. And then the recommendations are to amend the legislation to make it even easier to invoke it in the future. So I think many people are waking up to the fact that Canada is completely off course. It is not the country that they were raised in. I was speaking with one of my longstanding farm clients, and by longstanding, I mean about 10 years. And it's interesting, they're the same age as my wife and I, and their kids are the same age as my wife and I's kids. And I hadn't talked to them for a number of, maybe 2 years, 3, before COVID. And she said to me that she said to her husband, they immigrated from Europe, from the Netherlands. And she said, Hank, Canada is not the country we immigrated to anymore.
No.
And I think a lot of us feel that way, that this is an affirmation that this government in Ottawa and even provincial governments and now municipal governments with 15-minute cities are taking us so far away from Canadian values.
So Justice Rouleau, he gave himself a bit of an out in this whole thing. And I wanted to get your opinion because, lawyers will say things and judges will say things and your every layman won't know exactly what it is that they mean by it. But I have a quote here. I do not come to this conclusion easily, as I do not consider the factual basis for it overwhelming. And then he went on to say that other people with the right mind would probably not come to the same conclusions that he has. What was he indicating there? What is that, some sort of political out for him? As we know, this is more of a political process because it has really no teeth, and that we're going to be going elsewhere with it. And I'll ask you about that after. But what is the meaning of putting this language in his statement?
I don't know. Like, it's not some phraseology that as lawyers I would expect to see. There are things that someone who's not legally trained would look at and go, that's really weird. And you get 10 lawyers look at it and go, oh, no, that's totally normal why he'd say that. When I was talking to Brendan Miller on Friday, after we were both starting to go through the report, and I was like, Brendan, look what he said. He said, the high legal threshold has been met, but the factual basis is, not overwhelming.
It's not overwhelming, yeah.
And I'm like, those two things don't go together legally. And he's like, I know. And so in law school, you learn, and in practice, you're reminded of on all times. So the Oakes test under Section 1 of the Charter, for example, like it's basically a 4-part test. But what you have to do is they're empty boxes, like legal tests are. They're empty boxes. They have a label on them. And then you see if you can put facts in them that fit. Mm-hmm. And if they do, you meet the test. So you can't say on the one hand, the legal threshold is met. You can only say that if the factual case is there. So it's a legally incongruent statement. It's just remarkable, his report.
But he didn't go on any of the facts that are in the actual act. So the act is explicit. It says this is what it would take for the threshold to be met, and this is the case that every lawyer, I think, that was at the commission put forward in their case, because there's no reason to put any semantics in there. But semantics is what we got, because that was the semantics of the cabinet. So we're still yet to find out what was in some of the correspondence between cabinet members. That apparently there's a lawsuit going on right now to bring those correspondences to light, and hopefully that comes out. But what do you know about where we go next? What's happening next? There's apparently a judicial review. This isn't the end of it. So what happens from here?
Sure. So firstly, with respect to the Rouleau report, there's no appeal to that. There's no judicial review you can do on the inquiry. However, right after the Emergencies Act was invoked in the early days, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, the CCLA, so the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the CCF, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, all initiated judicial reviews. And you do that when you think a government has made a decision that they didn't have the authority to do, or that it was unreasonable or otherwise unlawful. You make an application to the court and you say, hey, these guys have blown it. They never had they didn't do it right, or they didn't have the legal authority to do it at all. Those 3 cases have been consolidated into one, and they're going to be heard in the first week of April. Justice Mosley of the federal court will be releasing a decision, presumably in maybe the end of April, May into June, sometime in that time window. And he will have to rule on whether or not, based on the evidence before him, the federal government had the preconditions present to legally invoke the Emergencies Act. If he rules that they didn't, that creates an interesting scenario where the immunities and protections from lawsuits that the federal government and the banks and other have lifts. So those who had their bank accounts frozen and others will be able to seek some justice and some compensation. But this is the federal court, and so far they've left some of us with the impression that they're more focused on protecting the government than adjudicating the law. So that I don't think we should put all of our eggs into that basket, but I think there are some other things we can do.
Well, what are the steps that your average Canadian can do to ensure that the courts don't get politicized in this step moving forward? You saying that it may only be a review that lasts a month in a court, and that is a considerably short amount of time for a judge to review all the details like we did in the inquiry. What can people do? Is it a matter of writing your MPs? Is it a matter of writing letters and sending your details off to people?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, Clyde, and those of others, that politicians, and I'm generalizing, but generally they're a whiteboard with no writing on it,
Mm-hmm.
and they're looking to see what people's views are on things and what their aspirations are, so that the politician can mimic it and cause you to decide that you're going to support them and say nice things about them to your friends and neighbors. You're going to send them a donation, and most importantly, you're going to put an X beside their name when the election comes. So I think we all as Canadians need to be much more clear and louder than we've ever been before in communicating with all of the elected officials in various political parties, including people who have an aspiration to become elected,
Mm-hmm.
and make it clear what our values are as Canadians, and making it easier for the federal government to strip people's freeze their bank accounts, their personal accounts, their business accounts, to suspend civil liberties, to trample on our charter rights, is not the kind of Canada that we want to raise our kids in. We just think if we really get loud about that, if you go back, and I don't recommend it for everybody's mental health, but if you go back and look at the press conference that the Prime Minister held this past Friday afternoon, speaking to the Rouleau report, and I call it the whitewash report for obvious reasons, but some of the phraseology he was using was freedoms are important, unity he was talking about, respect for one another, getting along together. He was actually parroting the key phrases that Tamara Lich first started using when she got on the convoy, when she got to Ottawa, and ever since. Because I think they realize, Tamara and the Freedom Convoy people, thousands, tens of thousands who were there, all had the same vision in mind, that Canada was deeply off track. The lockdowns were horrific in terms of the harms they caused, the overreach, and we need to get back to the true north, strong and free. So there's an example of people getting behind certain values and messages, and the politicians starting to react to it. That's what we got to do. We got to write to our members of parliament. One of the things we found out in the inquiry, don't forget this, they're hypersensitive to Twitter. Like, wow, was it ever surprising how the political staffers and the politicians and senior government officials were obsessed with Twitter? So write a letter, take a picture of it, tweet about it, CC as many as politicians as you can, and let's just really be loud and clear, talking to your neighbors and others about what we want to see our Canada look like for our kids.
Yeah, and I would suggest that this is a bipartisan issue. This is not something.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting any political party. I don't care. I was involved in an issue about 10 years ago here in Alberta where the government had gone off track and was attacking property rights of landowners. And such a groundwell of support emerged from it. I was doing town hall meetings. We didn't have this technology we have now, that so many people from across the province were raising concerns about this. In our Alberta legislature, the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, the Provincial Conservative Party, and the Wild Rose Party were all competing with one another as to who was the better or true defender of property rights, right?
Well, that's where we
because
should be,
they knew. Yeah, and so there's a perfect example of enough people speaking with clarity of vision on an issue, and the politicians mimic it. As Ralph Klein, Premier Klein, used to say, if you're a good politician, you'll find a parade and get in front of it. So let's create a parade so these guys can be effective in bringing Canada back to the true north, strong and free.
Keith Wilson, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you guys for joining in for these conversations. I feel like this is it's a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you come from. It's important to voice your opinion. Freedom and rights for everyone. This is the main message, and I think everyone can get on board with this. Anyway, leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.